Welcome to Housing Matters, the Vancouver Real Estate Show. I'm your host, Stuart McNish, coming to you from the studios at Old Boy Productions here in Vancouver. Joining me today in studio are Brook and Dr. Jonathan Woetzel, two experts on how to increase our use of underutilized land, both government and private sector lands. Now, let's get started with today's show. Joining me right now is renowned and former senior development planner of the City of Vancouver and retired founder of Brook Associates. Chuck's ability to navigate the labyrinth of the approval and permitting processes places him in a unique situation as he is compelled to retire from retirement and return to the housing market and help Vancouver meet its urgent housing needs for middle-income families. Chuck says we have a crisis when it comes to our ability to house the people who make the city work: police officers, teachers, nurses, and so on. His plan is to develop affordable rental housing on government and private lands that are already paid for. He points out that if we adopt this innovative approach, we can build homes for thousands of people. And the other benefactors are schools and hospitals and a wide range of other facilities. Chuck, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, Stu.
You know, you were at the same event that I was at a couple of weeks ago that was put on by the Urban Development Institute, where they had Dr. Jonathan Woetzel in from Shanghai.
Yes.
You know, this is a global leader in the study of what's going on in cities. And he said some of the problems that we're experiencing now, all the problems that we're experiencing here in Vancouver, they're everywhere. And the thing that I think stuck out with me the most, and he's going to be on after you, by the way, is that he talked about the fact that it's not that there isn't enough land in cities, it's that there's underutilized land. And this is something that's pulled you back out of retirement. How come?
Yes.
Like, why is it so important that we identify this and then start to do something about it?
Because we really have no choice, Stu, and I for the past 30 plus years, built a career on urban infill, which has always interested me. Mm-hmm. And much of my work involved finding space for additional housing in Vancouver. Most of that space was for condominium housing, which we see today. I came back because there is a desperate need in this city and other places for affordable housing for the people who need to live here but can't.
So a little point of clarification for somebody who doesn't know, what is urban infill? What do you mean when you say that?
Well, you might have a really good example is a shopping center. Mm-hmm. And our patterns of retail have changed, our modes of transportation have changed, particularly where you might have public transit like SkyTrain arriving at a shopping center. There are vast opportunities to begin backfilling the parking lots, the surface parking lots, that might have been very practical in the 50s and 60s, but today are a waste of land. Mm-hmm. And we've been wasteful of land since Vancouver started. We regard land as being plentiful, and in fact, it no longer is, and it's extraordinarily expensive.
So when you talk about shopping centers, I can't help but think, okay, well, hang on a second. Aren't you going to have pushback from the community? Aren't you going to have pushback from the city? If you say, well, I want to turn this parking lot into a tower and put people living there, are there not people who are going to say, well, not in my backyard, that's densification that I don't want?
Yes, and there's always a reaction, or at least usually a reaction, from the immediate neighbors. They're the ones who would feel most impacted by any change in their neighborhood, and we see that all the time. And Dr. Woetzel talked about the importance of not just hearing from those voices. If you look at affordable housing, it's a regional need. It is a regional benefit. It's certainly a benefit to the City of Vancouver or the District of North Vancouver, wherever you are. And it's important for the decision makers, i.e. city councillors, to listen to the broader voices and consider the needs of the greater community, perhaps even the region. Mm-hmm.
So what we see happening at Oak Ridge, for instance, would be an example of that then, wouldn't it?
Well, it would, except that I don't recall that there was any great community opposition to the proposed redevelopment.
Well, that's true. I don't see it as an opposition, but as a reconfiguring that space so that you have greater density. Absolutely. Because there was a tremendous amount of parking space there.
It was a sea of parking lots back in the day when we all drove Chevrolets.
Big ones.
Impalas, big Chevy Impalas with
Right.
Dinah Shore. But today, we've got the Canada line right there. And what you see is very intensive redevelopment of, in the case of Oak Ridge, that shopping center, which was a great asset. In the case of the Dogwood Pearson hospitals, which was greatly underutilized, had these little one-story buildings on them scattered around the trees, or even Langara Gardens, the apartment complex, these opportunities to really create livable housing at high density for workforce families, people who can't afford the Vancouver market, and that includes most of us and most of our children.
And this is really what this housing has to be directed at. And especially if we're able to take land that's already been in use, but repurpose it, we can create more affordable housing options. Is that the idea?
Yes, it is. And the idea for me came from a couple of places. I started to work with the North Vancouver School District in 1998 when the board was fired because they ran a deficit. And the trustee at the time asked me to come in and give them some advice around surplus assets, which might be monetized to cover the debt that the board at that time had incurred. And so I've been working on asset management planning for public clients who are land rich and cash poor for years, such as Vancouver Coastal Health, various school boards, and so forth, in ways to optimize their operations and at the same time find funding for their programs, usually capital programs, which are not covered by the Ministry of Education, such as the North Shore Outdoor Schools, such as additions to playfields, such as building a new school rather than seismically upgrading an old one.
So this is a change in thinking, because there's a part of me that goes, whoa, you want to do what to that school property? That's sacred ground. And yet, if we don't do it, then we rob the very people who maybe teach at that school the opportunity to live close to where they're working.
First of all, you don't have to sell it. I think we've learned, particularly from the experience of Simon Fraser University Trust and also from UBC Trust, that land in Vancouver, because it's so valuable, can be leased at the same value as if it were sold. So you can lease a land on a 99-year lease and get the same capture of equity without selling it and giving it away forever. So the land does come back to you. In the meantime, what's really critically important now is, let's talk about North Van School District. They can't hire staff. They can't hire teachers. They can't attract staff. If the weather is bad or if there's an accident on the Second Narrows Bridge, they have staffing issues because they can't attract people to come and live in the District of North Vancouver. There isn't housing for them. So this is where we begin to look at school district-owned assets. We look at the District of North Vancouver, the City of North Vancouver, District of West Vancouver. Mayor Linda Buchanan has started a task force to really begin to look at addressing the absence of affordable housing on the North Shore, and I salute her for that.
How big of a problem is this when we start talking about access to affordable housing for people who have pretty good paying jobs? How big, are we talking here? The number of people that need to be provided with that appropriate housing that is in the vicinity of where they work.
Well, you might have, for example, an adult child who's earning $160,000 or $170,000 a year, and they would struggle to find affordable housing in Vancouver.
At $160,000.
At $160,000, if you look at mortgage qualifications and all the other responsibilities that they have, such as childcare costs and transportation costs and so forth, very challenging. And that's before tax income, right? So it's very difficult for even our well-educated, high-income earning children to afford to live in our own city. That's how big a problem it is. It's not the affordability ratio. Typically, say for affordable rental housing, is in the $30,000 to $80,000 income range per family, and that's not $170,000. But the missing middle includes people up to that range. So we're going everywhere from someone making minimum wage right up to someone making a very good professional income. They can't live in Vancouver, and they have a really tough time living on the North Shore. And if they're trying to raise a family, it's bordering on impossible.
Well, talk to me about how this works. So let's say we've got school property, and you say you're not selling it, but you're repurposing it, and you've
Yes.
come up with a financial model. How then do you put housing onto that piece of property that then becomes affordable? Because are you still not building into the same construction costs and all those other things? How do you then make that affordable for the very people that we need to have in the community, not just teachers, nurses, police officers, firefighters, and so on?
This is where public land plays such a key role, Stu, because the high cost of housing, the most critically expensive piece of the whole housing puzzle, is the cost of land in Vancouver. There's nothing else like it in Canada, and with the possible exception of California and New York, very little of it in North America. What unlocks affordable housing is the ability to drive down the cost of the land. And if you're a school district, or you're a university, or you're a municipality, you may have land that you've owned for a century. The book cost of that land is close to nothing. You may even have captured that land back in a tax default during the Depression in the 30s. So you can deploy that land at a subsidized cost.
Because you're not giving up ownership.
You're not giving up ownership, and you're providing a community benefit. You can go back to the electorate and the taxpayers and say, this subsidy that we're providing by writing down the cost of our land, either partially or in total, is our contribution to the health of our community by keeping your children here, by providing for the support workers that we need, for the first responders and teachers that we need. That's the beauty of mobilizing public land, because then you've got a land cost that you can work with. And on top of that, we have agencies such as BC Housing.
Yes.
Particularly with recent programs developed by this government that are starting to really acknowledge that they're more than just non-market housing, which is for core need people. We also need to assist low-income earners and make housing more affordable for a broad section of the population.
So as I'm thinking my way through this, I'm going, okay, so you put that piece of property on or building on school property, and now the school starts to collect rent because they're, in essence, the landlord. But is it something that you then have to restrict to only teachers, or is it open to people who fit within a certain income group?
It's an income qualification. And one way to perhaps make teachers and teaching staff and school district staff, not just teaching staff, a priority is to say, give them the first 30 or 60 days to have a right to move into a project like that, so that you can attract them to the school district.
Wow.
I don't think it's feasible to restrict housing to a specific population. I'm not even sure that's legal.
So you're talking, yeah, probably not.
Probably
But you're talking school properties, hospitals. Where else do we find opportunities like this?
Golf courses. I have a bead
You
online.
be careful like that.
I'm a
There's
golfer
going to be
too.
golfers who are going to be mad at you.
Well,
Yeah.
my message to those of you at Langara is putt out.
Pot out.
Putt out, because you can't take a land asset like that, such a low-intensity land asset, on the Canada line, across from Dogwood Pearson and Langara Gardens with a new Canada line stop at 57th Avenue, and push through 36 or 52 rounds of golf a day for the benefit of the very, very few.
And that's a pretty substantial piece of property.
What
Can
is
you
the
imagine what you could do?
Imagine, and you still have ample park space. The city of Vancouver, in my humble view, need not be in the golf business. They already own 2 other courses, and I'm sure there's ample opportunity to play there. We can't afford to have a golf course in the middle of Vancouver anymore. That time has passed, and there are many, many other opportunities. The other really interesting opportunity is let's compare assets. The City of Vancouver, in its Property Endowment Fund, which is largely funded by land holdings, is about $3 billion, roughly.
Okay.
The Vancouver School Board is about $7 billion.
The school board has more
They're
property.
the gorilla. in the room.
And what about some of the hospital properties then?
Well, indeed. And as you see, the Dogwood Pearson is a perfect example of how you can take 27 acres that had practically nothing on it and make it very intense, build a new Canada Line stop, replace the facilities needed for the operation of the health district, and come up with a much more suitable form of housing for people who are in the middle class, if you want to call them that.
So you're devoting yourself to doing this. What's the appetite for it right now beyond North Vancouver, which you talk about? Because this isn't going to be something that just North Vancouver can do. It has to be throughout the region.
Oh, yeah. It's absolutely throughout the region and beyond. I'm also working in Victoria and on the island. And in any desirable urban setting, we're going to have affordability challenges because these cities are attractive to global buyers. And it's the global buyer that drives the real estate value here and in Toronto and New York and in San Francisco. And it's great news for those of us who already own property. It's bad news for those of us who are trying to afford it.
And so why do we need to care about this so much when we think about the future well-being of the city?
Because what we're going to wind up with, and I dare say we're starting to see glimmers of this already, is first of all, there will be no ability for us as we age or for our children as they age and want to remain in the community to do so. We don't have enough affordable seniors housing, and we don't have enough affordable workforce housing. We wind up with, dare I say it, on the west side, communities which are diminishing rapidly. That their housing is still there, but the families and the people are not. And whether it's lack of families with children or whether it's empty homes, we're going to experience, we are already experiencing, a diminishment of community, and that's very bad for the health of a city.
It's hard to believe that we could have that threat in a city like this. And the reason being that we can't provide appropriate housing for the people who have to make the city work.
We did a brilliant, if you read the city's housing policies that came out in June, June 20th, a year ago, they're really revealing. Because what one policy in particular shows is that we've done a really, really good job of supplying Vancouver with condominium product.
Yes.
And we've done an ample job or an adequate job of providing non-market housing for the bottom. Everything in between has been omitted, and we can't move forward without addressing that critical need now.
Because it's the engine of the economy. It's the engine of the city, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
So I have, aside from Langara Golf Course, I've got lots of ideas about using these highly valuable public lands in new ways.
Did you ever envision that this would start to become the reason that you got into this business? Because you're operating with a level of passion. You've always been a passionate guy ever since I've known you, but you're operating with a level of passion that has elevated your level of interest in this. Why is it so important?
Because I'm older and I'm wiser, and for me this is, I'm really just setting out on this task. But it will be immensely gratifying and satisfying for me to make a difference. That's what I want my legacy to be. Not that I did 300 condominium buildings or whatever it is, but that I really made a difference in finding ways for people to afford to live here.
So we can look at police officers, firefighters, ambulance attendants, and on, people who will benefit from this. But I can also tell you that I have clients who talk about the fact that when they go to hire new grads from university in Vancouver, they have to pay them considerably more here to be able to recruit somebody to stay. And so the entire economy, I think, benefits when we have entry-level housing that is within reach.
When I moved here in 1986 from Winnipeg, where I was an urban planner, I took a pay cut.
To come here.
Because the salary scale here is lower, and the cost of housing is astronomically higher. So you don't have to have a PhD in math to know that it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to remain in this city.
And if we want to continue to grow and be a vibrant, expanding society.
A real society, not a faux society, not a Potemkin city, which is what we risk becoming.
Oh, well, there are people who I know who say we are not an international city or a global city. We are a large town.
Well, Arthur Erickson described it, I think, as an urban resort, which might be a good way to describe Vancouver for lack of head offices and for lack of adequate housing and jobs in its core.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wish you luck because we definitely need this to happen. Thanks for coming in and doing this.
Thank you very much, Stu. Been a pleasure.
Joe. Joining me now is Dr. Jonathan Woetzel, Senior Partner and Director of McKinsey Global Institute at McKinsey & Company. He's based in Shanghai. Dr. Woetzel's research has been crucial in understanding the growth and the supports that shape economies in cities in China, Asia, and around the world. He says that even though we think that Vancouver's real estate challenges are unique, other cities around the world have been grappling with many of the same problems for a long time. What kind of lessons can we learn from them? Dr. Woetzel, welcome.
Thank you, Stuart.
We here in this little patch of earth on the west coast of Canada seem to think that we have a bit of a unique affordability problem. But after listening to you speak earlier today, it's not so unique, is it?
No, I'd say affordable housing is a global concern that by this time in a couple of years, we think maybe over 1.5 billion people will be in this kind of an affordable housing challenge.
1.5 billion? Why? What's going on? How come this is a universal challenge that we're all facing?
Well, there are two varieties of affordable housing challenge. There's the challenge where you just don't have any housing.
Yes.
And there's the challenge where it just costs too much. And the first challenge is really a matter of the developing markets and the Lagos or Manilas of the world. The second is Vancouver, New York, LA, London, Berlin, Shanghai. And
on and on and on and on.
and on. Right, exactly.
So what are the factors then that come together that create a situation where, prices keep rising? They seem to rise out of sync with affordability or income levels in these cities. And, you just mentioned a whole list of world-class cities. And if they're having the same issue, what were the pressures that made that happen?
Well, real estate's a really interesting commodity. It's one of the few commodities which is actually two commodities. It's a store of value and it's shelter. Mm-hmm. And one price does not clear two markets. So for any given piece of land, there's a market for it as an investment commodity, and there's a market for it for shelter.
Are we, I don't know if you know this, but in our province, there's been this tax that's been put on any land or property that is held in speculation. And you're saying as a commodity, that's somebody who's speculating against an increase in future value. Can you actually put a stop to that investment in land as a commodity?
Well, when you tax something, we know you get less of it. Mm-hmm. So when that tax is applied to buildings, people will stop building buildings because they're just too expensive. They are there for use and for purchase. Whereas land, if you tax land, you can't get any less of it. So what happens is the value goes up and it forces people to come with new and different ways of using that land.
Even if you tax it?
That was the Milton Friedman used to say that the only tax he would approve of was a tax on land, because it would not essentially you would never have any less of it. It would only increase the value of the land itself.
But then that deprives us of trying to make that land more affordable. The more tax you put on it, the more it costs, the less affordable it is.
It does. So this goes back to then, what are we using that land for? Now, if we decide that we want to use that land for making a park or making a single-family home, well, that's going to only benefit the people who use the park or that one person who lives in the single-family home.
Right.
So we could decide that we instead wanted to use that for transport and build a six-story housing on top of it, in which case we'd have a different use of that land.
Right.
It's really up to us. We can decide which way we want to do it.
How important is continuing to increase supply if we want to maintain affordability?
I think that, I mean, it's sort of economics 101, right? That, if you lower supply or you don't, and demand goes up, well, price goes up. So, I mean, yes, it's absolutely critical in particularly environments like Vancouver and other big cities where you do have robust demand, and demand is actually critical to the health and the overall standard of living of the metropolis to continue to increase supply. I mean, if we don't increase supply, prices will go up.
Cities around the world, though, seem to fall into this idea of, well, we're going to put in this restriction, that bylaw, this tax, and so on, and they seem to slow down the process of increasing the supply. And in essence, by doing whatever they're doing to think that they're helping the market, they're impeding it. Are there cities around the world that we can look at and say, well, no, they got it, they increased supply, and everybody benefited?
Well, I think yes. I mean, first of all, the cities that are doing that are the cities that continue to grow at a healthy rate, that also raise the standard of living for all their citizens, that have relatively good social infrastructure. And so these things are all pretty highly correlated. So if we look at cities where all that is happening, those are the ones that we may be able to draw more lessons from. So where?
Where?
Okay, well, I think it's a great question. I would argue the Nordics have been doing a reasonably good job, in particular Stockholm, which is the fastest growing capital city in Europe. And that's partially due to immigration and partially due to in-migration from the countryside. There's obviously the Asian cities. I mean, I think that for decades, whether it's Korea, Seoul, or Incheon, or now China, or Singapore, they've had to deal with big population growth, spiraling increases in costs, and yet somehow they have doubled or tripled the housing stock over the course of the last couple of decades.
Now, they operate under a different political environment than we do, and so they have the ability to move some of these things through differently. But are there lessons that we can take from, let's say, Shanghai? I mean, you take a look at the population, but the transformation of that city. Are there lessons that we can take from there and apply them here?
Well, what we see is that most of these areas, I mean, everybody starts where they start in terms of whatever system they have and how they allocate land and how long it takes you to get a developer's license or what have you. What matters is how fast they improve that. So that's the main lesson, is that what have they done to make that process more representative, more fair, and more transparent, faster. And so if we look at things like the ease of doing business index that the World Bank puts out, one of the measures is how long does it take you to register your property? And how long does it take you to get an entitlement to develop a property? What they have done is they've digitized, they have decentralized, they have created special courts in some cases to adjudicate matters of environment or property rights. They've addressed what is their local issue, and they've done so in a systematic way. I think every locality is going to have its own question, but the reality is that they have to change their process and to make it fit their local context and to do it better. That's what's common.
So when we take a look here, you can look at a development application, through the permit can easily go 24 to 36 months, in some cases more. That really slows down the ability of the market to respond to the demands of the market.
Exactly. And I think that's what we should focus on. We should say, how responsive are we being? In some ways, I would say a democracy, that shouldn't be a handicap. We shouldn't think our system is necessarily making it more difficult to respond than places which may not call themselves democracies, but respond faster.
Well, the idea of creating, and I believe that it has, the creation of a nexus line in Vancouver for the permitting process around rental housing has been introduced, but it is not across the board as far as the development of all properties, and yet it's a good idea.
Yeah. Transit-oriented development, this is it's an extremely important topic because the transit is creating the value. What transit is first of all, a public good that is introduced by society as a way of benefiting all of us, but it creates tremendous value in the adjacency to the transit. And so the question is, who gets to use that value?
Right.
Is it a single-family home?
Well, you touch on a very interesting point here, because it has been raised by the Urban Development Institute that we have areas of transit that are underutilized because we haven't built the density around that. And yet it's vitally important. Is that not the essence of what a city is?
Indeed. I mean, we've made this comment today that, what do we call a place where you have lots of people who can't move around? We call that a prison. So the difference between a prison and a city is transport.
Right. And when we take a look at the way that cities have developed, particularly in North America over the last 40 or 50 years, they sprawled out, putting people into cars, and then created this gridlock. We have to get beyond that, don't we?
Well, gridlock, this automotive revolution that we're going into, or the mobility revolution, I suppose, is a reflection of technology and what it allows us to do, and it's really about access. It's saying that what we need is a healthy life. A healthy life needs access to education, to healthcare, and recreation. And so we really don't want to travel that much. Nobody wants to get in their car and go for 2 hours.
Right.
What we want is the education and the health to be here with us, barring that, to be as little in the way as possible. So that's where we're going. And I think congestion is essentially a pricing signal. It says, well, you've done too much on the road. You need to do something differently.
Right. So we need to make cities walkable and have a good transit infrastructure. What else is important as far as making sure that we can create affordable and accessible dwellings?
Well, there's a concept of the strong, smart neighborhoods that, within a 20-minute walk, you have everything you need, whether it's security or health or education or basic retail and commerce, public transport access. So thinking at the neighborhood level about how does one provide that to each and every resident, I think that's, the day in the life. So that includes green space. We know that very big, large parks don't really do very much for health. Rather, 5 minutes of green a day in your neighborhood plot does miracles for your blood pressure. So those kind of neighborhood level innovation amenities, I suppose, are what we need. And beyond that, we actually need a conversation. We need to have the ability of neighborhoods to work together and to recognize they're part of a greater city. And that dialogue, that's actually what we need.
And so we need people to be citizens.
Well,
we need them to be responsible and engaged citizens.
Members of the community. I think these days in many countries, citizen is a valuated term.
Okay, member of the. But we do have a responsibility to also give back to that place that we want to call home.
Correct.
And if so, then, as you say, we can create these smart, livable cities where everything is within a very tight environment.
Well, it's accessible to us. And
Yes.
that's, I think, because we are creatures of our communities, or we shape our communities then shape us and the habits. So making those communities immediately accessible is where we start.
Rental housing is always an important component in any environment because not everybody has the ability to pull together the down payment that's required to purchase. How important is it that we keep a cap on rental prices so that we can ensure that rental housing is affordable? Is that the way to go, or should we follow something like the Seattle model?
Well, that's a really tricky question because first of all, I have deep sympathy for people who say, well, the rent is just too darn high. You know, if we are making a decision, and this is perhaps not the case in Canada, certainly in North America, where I have to either go to the doctor or pay the rent, well, there's something wrong here. And so when we are in this situation where it says that it is at that precariat subsistence level that we're trying to address the problem, well, then yes, maybe we need to do something. Maybe we need to think about what it is that we can do to support a more available standard of living or housing standard. But as we know, if we, over the long term, sort of intervene and make it impossible to earn a return on rental housing, then people won't build rental housing. And so essentially, we look for models closer to, say, the German or the Swiss model, where 60 or 70% of the population rents, but it's financed on a long-term basis by, in the case of Germany, regional or provincial state banks, which are there to support the developers in creating that long-term rental finance, because otherwise, basically, the bankers would just not support it. They would say, I'm here to sell a building, not to collect rent over the next 10 years.
Right, because they need to have a return on their investment. investment.
Indeed, right.
Otherwise, why put your money there?
Right. So this has to be set up. The whole system actually has to reflect the fact that we do expect rental housing to be a substantial portion of the community, needs on a long-term basis, and that the financing channels for developers to build to that has to be there.
So we're only just touching on the surface of this in this interview. Where can people go to get more information about the insights that you bring to, like, understanding the pressures that are at work? Because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who go, okay, I want to know more. We can't cover it all right now, so where can they go?
Well, McKinsey/MGI.com.
Okay.
The McKinsey Global Institute puts out, which I'm a member of, a director of, puts out a lot of research on urbanization broadly, and specifically on this question of affordable housing at a global level and also at a regional and state level. Beyond that, there are many very valuable industry resources. The Lincoln Land Institute, I put a plug in for them. They do a great job of researching all matters related to real estate. Columbia University has a great center as well, and NYU. I think the Furman Center, quite good. And I'm sure the Urban Development Institute right here in Vancouver, I mean, has great on-the-ground experience and lots of folks who could really have a good conversation here.
Yeah, well, I know you got to go because you got to catch a flight, but thank you so much for coming in and sharing your insights with us. That wraps up today's show. Now, just before I sign off, I want to encourage you to take in a couple of other Vancouver Sun and Province podcasts. The first is White Towel, hosted by Paul Chapman. Paul and a series of guest hosts bring you everything you want to and need to know about the Canucks. And for all you news junkies on all things political in Victoria, you'll want to tune into In the House, hosted by Mike Smith and Rob Shaw. Thank you for tuning in on Apple Podcasts, thevancouversun.com, and theprovince.com, and on the Vancouver Sun's YouTube channel. And be sure to subscribe because you don't want to miss an episode. And as well, I want to acknowledge Arnold Chang, Greta Gibson, and Derek Hayter, without whom this show would not be possible. What a great team I have the pleasure of working with. I'm Stuart McNish. Thanks for joining us on Housing Matters, the Vancouver Real Estate Show. See you next time.